Welcome to our discussion on other factors that influence socialization, otherwise known as cross-cutting cleavages. The way in which political opinions are formed helps explain the cleavages that exist among these opinions and why these cleavages do not follow any single political principle, but instead overlap and cross-cut in a bewildering complexity. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers and other peers influence in political socialization. Through peers, we learn about community and the political climate and the value of the area in which we live. For example, your neighbors might inform you that a particular member of the city council is a strong advocate for your neighborhood on the council, securing funds for recreational facilities or increased police protection in your area. Or, a coworker might let you know what your member of Congress is doing to help save jobs in the industry in which you work. Much research indicates that the primary impact of peers is to reinforce our already held beliefs and values, however. Typically, the people with whom you are acquainted are quite similar to you. Although diversity exists in many settings, the norms and values of the people you know tend to be remarkably similar to your own. Political and community leaders also help socialize people and influence public opinion. Positions advocated by highly regarded government leaders hold particular sway, and the president plays an especially important role in shaping Americans' views. For example, President Obama's prioritization of health care reform propelled it to become a higher priority for many average Americans. But the role of political leaders in influencing public opinion is not limited to the national stage. In your city, chances are that the views of community leaders, elected and not, influence the way the public perceives local policies. Perhaps the fire or police chief endorses a candidate for city council, or the popular football coach or the police athletic league make the funding of a new football field a policy priority in your town. Often we rely on the recommendation and priorities of well-respected leaders who have earned our trust. We are often influenced in our life experiences, which shape our political socialization and therefore what we think. The racial and ethnic groups we belong to, our gender, our age, and the events that have shaped our lives and where we live all play a role in how we are socialized to political and community life, our values and priorities, and even whom we vote for. Demographic characteristics also shape our levels of civic involvement and may even help determine the ways in which we contribute to the civic life of our communities and our nations. Race and ethnicity is a very important cross-cutting cleavage. Whites, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans prefer different candidates, hold different political views, and have different levels of civic involvement. Among the most salient of these differences are the candidate preferences of African Americans who strongly support Democratic candidates over Republicans. In this graphic, it shows that in 2008, President Obama won majorities from Latinos, Asian Americans, and particularly African Americans, 95% of whom voted for President Obama. This proportion exceeds the share of the African American vote the Democratic presidential candidates have garnered in recent years, which has averaged 84 to 90%. The 43% of the white vote that President Obama won exceeds the 41% that John Kerry received in 2004, and the average of 39% of white votes that Democratic candidates have received since 1964. This breakdown of 2008 voter preferences is not unique, but rather it reflects well-established differences in party affiliation and ideology between racial and ethnic minorities and whites. But there are also significant differences even within racial and ethnic groups. In this table, it shows how the various categories of Latinos differ in terms of party identification. As the table shows, Latinos who identify themselves as Puerto Rican are very likely to be Democrats, while roughly half of all ethnic Latino groups are likely to be Democrats. Party affiliation among ethnic groups within the Asian American community also varies somewhat. As this figure shows, in general, about 60% of all Asian Americans are registered Democrats. South Asians are most likely to be Democrats, and majorities of Chinese and Koreans are Democrats as well. A quarter to a third of all Korean, Southeast Asian, Filipino, and Chinese Americans are unaffiliated with either party. White, African American, Latino, and Asian American youth also differ significantly in their level of civic engagement, as well as in how young people in these groups connect with their communities. Trends reported in the civic and political health of the nation, a detailed look at how youth participate in politics and communities, included the following. African American youth are the most politically engaged racial or ethnic group. They are most likely to vote, belong to political groups, make political contributions, display buttons or signs, canvass voters, and contact the media about political issues. Asian Americans are more likely to have been active in their communities. They are more apt to work to solve community problems, volunteer, engage in boycotts, sign petitions, and raise charitable contributions. Young Latinos are the least likely to be active in politics on their their communities, but they are most likely to have engaged in political protests. 1/4 of Latinos, more than twice the proportion of any other group, have protested, primarily in immigration rights demonstrations. The lack of civic involvement may arise from barriers to participation, including the fact that many Latino youths in the United States are not citizens, which would bar them from voting. The slogan of many immigration reform marches, "Today we march, tomorrow we vote," may be a promise of increased political participation among young Latinos in the future. Young white people are moderately likely to engage in many political and community activities. They are more likely than other groups to run, walk, or bike for charity, and they are also more likely to be members of community or political groups. Of the groups of young people considered here, they are the least likely to protest, the least likely to contribute money to a political cause, and the least likely to persuade others to vote. Let's talk about the gender gap. Public opinion polls and voting behavior indicate that that men and women have very different views on issues, have different priorities when it comes to public issues, and often favor different candidates, particularly in national elections. This difference in men's and women's views and voting preferences is called the gender gap. The measurable difference in the way women and men vote for candidates and in the way they view political issues. Eleanor Smeal, who at the time was president of the National Organization for Women, first noticed the gender gap. In the 1980 presidential election, Democratic incumbent Jimmy Carter lost to the Republican challenger Ronald Reagan. But Smeal noticed that in poll after poll, women favored Carter. Since that watershed 1980 election, the gender gap has been a factor in every subsequent presidential election. Women voters are more likely than men to favor Democratic candidates. President Bill Clinton, first elected in 1992, had the smallest gender gap that year, with women voters favoring him only by 4%. 4 years later, when he ran for re-election, he had the largest gender gap to that point, with women voters favoring him by 11%. In the 2008 presidential election, the gender gap continued to favor the Democratic nominee, with women voters favoring Barack Obama over John McCain by 7%. The presence of Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as the Republican vice presidential nominee appeared not to have swayed vast numbers of women voters. Voting turnout patterns increase the effect of the gender gap. Women in most age groups, except those under age 25, are more likely to vote than their male counterparts. In addition, on average, women also live longer than men, so older women constitute an important voting bloc. The difference in women's candidates' preferences and their higher likelihood of voting means that the gender gap is a political reality that any candidate seeking election cannot ignore. Young men and women also differ in their level of civic engagement, in the ways in which they are involved with their communities, and in their perspectives on the government. While majorities of young men and women believe it is their responsibility, rather than their choice, to get involved to make things better for society, how they choose to get involved varies by gender. As this figure shows, women in particular are more likely to participate in certain forms of fundraising activities for charity. Men and women are more equally likely to work on solving community problems, such as volunteering for a nonprofit mediation service that helps negotiate disputes between neighbors. Men are more likely than women to choose formal political forms of activism, such as voting, persuading others to vote, and contributing money to political campaigns. Women and men's opinions also differ on public policy issues, though often in unexpected ways. On the other hand, there is very little difference of opinion between men and women on the issue of abortion. On the other hand, men and women's views on the optimal role of government vary greatly. 66% of young women believe that government should do more to solve problems versus 60% of young men, whereas only 27% of women believe that government does too many things better left to businesses and individuals, as opposed to 35% of men. Women are also more likely to believe that the United States is at risk of another terrorist attack since September 11, 2001, and they are less likely to feel safe from terrorism. Women, too, are more likely to believe that going to war in Iraq was a mistake, and they are more likely to have reached that conclusion earlier than men. When it comes to domestic priorities, men and women are equally likely to cite jobs and the economy as high priorities, but women are more likely to consider health care a priority. Men are about 10% more likely to favor the death penalty than are women. Do the different life experiences of men and women help to explain some of their policy preferences and hence their candidate preferences? Excuse me. Let's look at age and events. Differences in the candidates voters prefer, party, gender, and the age of the candidates themselves are one reflection of age and political opinions. People's opinions are also influenced by the events they have lived through and by their political socialization. An event may lead to a widespread change in political views. The generational effect, sometimes called the age cohort effect, is the impact of a significant external event in shaping the views of a generation. Typically, generational effects are felt most strongly by young people, aged as a result of the attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. People who were under the age of 30 on that day might place a heightened security on keeping the United States safe in face of a new kind of threat, for instance. Other key events that have helped shape the socialization of a generation include the Great Depression and World War II. For the oldest Americans and the war in Vietnam, and the changes in society that occurred during the 1960s for the baby boom generation born between 1946 and 1964. The major events that occur while we grow up affect our socialization by shaping our viewpoints and our policy priorities. One of the strongest examples of the generational effect is the Great Depression. The oldest Americans who came of age during the era of Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal social programs remain most likely to vote Democratic, but often the impact of events is not immediately apparent. Political scientists continue to measure the effects of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks and the subsequent war on terror on the views of the generation socialized to politics during the first decade of the 21st century. In the 2008 presidential election, young voters strongly preferred Barack Obama over Republican candidate Senator John McCain. But was this difference in candidate preference a result of the generational effect? Will the Americans who grew up in the wake of those attacks be more patriotic than their parents? Will they resist a militaristic foreign policy throughout their lifetimes? These type of questions will interest public opinion researchers in the decades to come. The last cross-cutting cleavage that we're going to talk about is geographic region. Since the nation's founding, Americans have varied in their political attitudes and beliefs and how they are socialized to politics depending on the region of the United States from which they come. These differences stem in part from the historical patterns of immigration. Irish and Italian immigrants generally settled in the northeastern seaboard, influencing the political region of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Chinese immigrants, instrumental in building the Transcontinental Railroad in the 19th century, settled in California and areas of the Pacific Northwest and have had a major impact on the political life of those areas. Among the most important regional differences in the United States is the difference in political outlook between those who live in the Northeast and those who live in the South. The differences between these two regions predate even our nation's founding. During the Constitutional Convention in 1787, northern and southern states disagreed as to the method that should be used to count slaves for the purposes of taxation and representation. The differences between these two regions were intensified in the aftermath of the Civil War, the quintessential manifestation of regional differences in the United States. Since the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln in the North, the South became essentially a one-party region, with all political competition occurring within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party dominated the South until the latter part of the 20th century, when many Democrats embraced the civil rights movement. Differences in regional culture and political viewpoints between North and South remain. Today, in national elections, Republicans tend to carry the South, the West, and most of the Midwest, except for large cities in these regions. Democrats are favored in the Northeast, on the West Coast, and in most major cities. This table illustrates one factor that contributes to these differences in regional political climate: religious affiliation. Although differences in religious affiliation are often a function of people's heritage, church membership can alter the political culture of a region through the perpetuation of values and priorities. As this table shows, the South is much more Protestant than other regions of the United States. Not surprisingly, Republicans dominate in this area, particularly among religious Protestants, born-again Christians, and evangelicals. Catholics and Jews tend to dominate in the Northeast along the East Coast. Both groups are more frequently supporters of the Democratic Party. People without a religious affiliation who tend to value independence and have negative views of governmental activism tend to live in the West and vote Republican. We can discern many of the similarities and differences between the political beliefs of members of these various demographic groups because of the increasingly sophisticated and accurate ways in which we can measure public opinion.